we'll get started because we have a lot to talk about today. And people, will keep joining in as we get started. But today is our last session of our draft submit, revise our manuscript writing series that we've been doing since February of this year. And so we're really excited to bring you sort of the end of what you would be doing if you were actually writing a manuscript, which is navigating submissions. Our favorite part, right? It's always very exciting when we get to the peer review process. Exciting in a terrifying way, right? We always love that email saying, your peer review is back. So we have a really great set of panelists for you that have lots of experience being the editor of journals. And then at the end, we have a great speaker from SMPH's media strategy team who can help talk about how we can disseminate our manuscript findings, our research through the media, through public dissemination. But first, we're going to introduce our speakers that we have, our panelists, and then we're going to get into a question and answer about typical, reviewer responses that we might be getting and any sort of problems that we deal with when we have those. So I'll let each of you introduce yourselves to the group, and then we'll dive into those questions. So we're going to start with Dr. Jill Barnes. I know you don't have any slides for us, which is totally fine. So if you just want to introduce yourselves now, and then we'll get to Eulalia.
Right. Thank you, Jen. My name is Jill Barnes. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology. I have served on numerous editorial boards and served as a review editor. And currently, I'm a senior editor for the Journal of Experimental Physiology. And I'm also an associate editor for the Journal of Applied Physiology.
Wonderful. All right.
Hi, folks. I am Wisconsin-Madison. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. I'm also an associate editor for Family Medicine, one of the Society of Teachers of Family Medicine journals, our flagship journal. And this is an area of expertise, passion. I don't know, as it is for all of us, right? Like when we receive, as Jen was saying, when we receive our revisions, it is, probably triggering in some ways, probably exciting, scary, and really here to say as an associate editor that revisions are the norm. We've heard of folks taking the revisions email and thinking that their paper has been rejected. And indeed, that is definitely not the case. This is really much a part of the process. And so just know that it's the expectation, the norm, and that it's hard. It's hard to receive some feedback that feels like somebody is criticizing you. Jen, if you could go to the next slide. And so with that is that remember that they're critiquing your work in the peer review kind of way, and they're not critiquing you. It can be really emotional to elicit an emotional response when we get that email. And it's important that we kind of separate ourselves from that. And so I usually tell folks to take off a cool off period. Read those comments on first round and then take some time and really process them. Come back once you're able to kind of separate yourself from that initial emotion. This is a question that often comes up of, well, do I have to answer every single comment? Do I have to respond to every single comment? In short, yes. And you don't have to agree with every single comment. Sometimes we can absolutely disagree. It is absolutely appropriate to disagree. And at the same time, it is important that we address every single item. So you don't have to agree with everything they say, but you do have to give an explanation of, if you're disagreeing, you have to give them a good reason why. And then the other thing that I'll add here is another question that often comes up is like, well, how much do I have to respond? Is it okay to just say completed? And, I think some of this is, while it is stylistic, it is a balance. You do want to express some gratitude there. You do want to acknowledge the time that folks took and acknowledge that your reviewer is a human too, just like we are human in our responses to our revision emails. They all are also human as well, your associate editor, your reviewers. So there's good language examples that you can find. There's this PDF that you can find online going to cmu.edu. And just like sometimes expressing gratitude, sometimes it is perfectly okay to say, completed. And the next slide. And then the last thing that I'll mention is the importance of really making it easy for your associate editor to do their job and for them to figure out whether or not you address their comments and recommendations. And really, it is your job to make it show that you did your best in addressing their comments. I really like the use of tables. This is an example table that academic medicine provides to folks when they're submitting their revisions. And I highly recommend using something that it just makes it easy. You don't have to use a table. I think tables are great. As an associate editor, I can follow along really nicely, but you don't have to. And then as you can see, so in this type of organization, you'd repeat the comment, you'd describe your revisions, and then you'd put the information about where to find those revisions. So again, you're just trying to make your AE's job really easy. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. All right, Sherry.
Hi, my name is Sherry Salzman-Scott, and I am the senior editor for the journal Clinical Medicine and Research, which is published by Marshfield Clinic Research Institute. In my role with the journal, I manage all the editorial and publishing operations, so everything from the time a manuscript is submitted to the journal through peer review and decisions and the final publication and production of the actual issues of the journal. I come from a scientific background with my degrees all within the sciences. I've been working as within the publishing industry for scientific journals for about 20 years. And prior to that, I had worked in basic science research, doing studying the molecular basis of a few different forms of human cancer, as well as I had done some gene mapping work as well. I dabbled for a period of time with scientific writing as a freelancer, so I have some experience there as well. When I'm not working, Jen, if you want to flip to the next slide. When I'm not working, you're likely to find me training or playing with my dogs, competing in various canine sports such as nose work, agility, rally obedience. And my two office assistants are felines, and they make sure that I have enough caffeine on board and that my desk is always occupied. And Beignet, my orange tabby cat, he likes to lay across my desk. So I apologize if he walks across my screen while we're during the session today. You can go on. Some of the questions that had come in, there was kind of a series of questions that dealt with manuscript rejection. So I thought I'd start out this portion of the session with some of those. One of the questions was about how can I, prevent or minimize the chance that my manuscript will be rejected. So I can speak a bit from the journal's perspective in the journal office as well. I invite my fellow panelists to chime in. But some of the things you can do when you're first submitting your manuscript is to make sure you've followed all of the submission guidelines for your journal of choice. So pull those down and just go through it carefully. Submit all your required supporting documentation at the appropriate time. A lot of it's your journal will want you to submit up front when you're submitting your initial manuscript submission. Some things like copyright or a licensing to publish agreement may be required at the end when your manuscript is accepted, or it might be required up front as well. Figures, of course, you want those to be in the right format. If you have questions about that, you can always contact the editorial office. They're there to help you with anything. Things you can do with the manuscript. Generally, a great idea is to have someone who doesn't know your work read it for you before you submit. They may find places within the manuscript that they don't understand. I mean, there may be someone within the sciences as well, but in a different area. So they may not understand your specific discussions, and they may give you some ideas for ways to rework that area so that a broader audience will understand it, because not all of your editors at the journals will have the specific expertise of your work. So you want to make it easier for everyone to understand. Of course, if you have trouble with writing or English language, you want to enlist an expert to help you in that. If you have access to statisticians to help you with your analyses, always, another great thing to enlist their help. When you get to the revision stages after you've received your requests for revisions, UW has already given you a great way to address those in the table format. You can do a point-by-point format in a letter. Another thing within the manuscript itself, you want to make sure that your changes stand out and make it as easy as possible for your editors and reviewers to find them, your changes. So use track changes or a different color font or something to pull those out, make it easy for the person looking at that revision to find those changes. Always, as Yulia said, you want to be respectful and gracious in your responses. I would add to what Yulia said that most editors and most reviewers are not paid in any way for doing the work that they do. They're doing it completely in an altruistic manner to help advance science and help you advance your own science. So always really be gracious and appreciate what they're doing for you. And again, if you have questions throughout the process, you can always contact your editorial office. They're there to help you with whatever you have questions about. So I don't know if the other panelists have other things they would like to add about, different things they could do, authors could do to reduce their chances of having their manuscript rejected. Feel free to.
This is Yuali. I just want to add and reemphasize your point, Sherry. Looking at your author instructions and guidelines before you start writing, before you submit, and again before you submit your revision. I cannot stress that enough. And the first pass is being done by your editor-in-chief, and they might just be doing it by checklist, right? Like, did you do, and the staff, did you do this, X, Y, Z, A, B, C? And you might be rejected on that first pass just because you didn't follow a very simple instruction on your in your submission. Like maybe you didn't put page numbers and you were supposed to put page numbers. So really, really, really cannot stress that enough of the importance of following those instructions.
Jill, did you have anything to add to that?
Not at this time. I think that was a great summary.
Another question that was brought up specifically dealt with reject and resubmit decisions. Kind of what does that mean and what do I do about it? So what it means from, I can speak again from the journal perspective and the editor's perspective as well. The editors and the reviewers see value in your work, in the study that you've done, and they're interested in the subject matter. However, there's probably some major issue with the manuscript, a problem, a flaw, something they don't feel you can address appropriately or fully within a standard revision. So they want you to go back and maybe do more research, collect more data, do your analyses differently, something that's going to take a very large amount of time, a lot of really complete reworking of the paper. So it's not that they don't like it or appreciate it. They do. They just want you to do things differently. What you would want to do in that scenario is to try to take as much of that feedback to heart and make as many of the changes as you possibly can before you send that manuscript back to the journal. You are sending it back as a new submission, so you don't necessarily need to do the point-by-point response, but do know that if it's the same journal, they will remember your paper. So they can go back and pull out the original version and see if you've made changes and what changes you did make, if they really want to. So just, try to incorporate their feedback as best as possible. However, if you're unable to make those changes for some reason, or any reason, or you really just don't want to, maybe you completely disagree, you really should send your work to a new journal then, because you won't get it accepted at the same one. So the next question that I was going to respond to was that if you have questions about the work or the comments you've received from your reviewers, the best way to go about getting that clarified is to go through the editorial office, whatever method you used to submit your manuscript originally. Most journals use some sort of online submission system like Scholar One or Editorial Manager, and they all have an email the office feature built into them. So in your manuscript's record itself, there's an email the office feature. So just use that link, send your questions to the office. Sometimes the systems are set up so that whoever the handling editor will automatically get those emails. Other times it goes through the office and they'll forward it to the editor. However, that editor, the handling editor, is going to be your liaison with the reviewer to get your clarifications made, and they'll get back to you with answers. If you're in a situation where you have an open review format and you know who the reviewers are, please don't contact them directly. They really don't like that. So, don't go trolling the internet and find their email addresses and send them emails. Just go through the editorial office and your handling editor to get those answers. The last thing I was going to mention was that if you get questions about or comments about your writing or your language usage, do you need to address those? Well, obviously, yes, you do. If your editors and reviewers cannot understand your study because of the language gaps in it, if you're not a native English speaker, please enlist the help of someone who is to help you write your paper. Use all the services that have been brought up throughout the series to help you, professional editors, language, English experts. Use friends and colleagues to read your paper. Of course, your mentors are a super source of help, so go to them as well. But make sure that your language is clear, your writing is fluid, and your use of the English language and grammar are all appropriate, so that your manuscript has the best chance of being ushered all the way through all the stages of peer review, and hopefully you'll get an accept decision then. So, and that's all for me.
So, do any of the others have any, add-ons to any of these points before we get into sort of more detailed questions?
I would like to emphasize one thing that Sherry said is about the way to contact the editor or the handling editor should be through the whatever web portal that the journal uses. I know at the two journals that I'm an associate editor or senior editor for, we are not allowed to interact in any way. So everything has to go through the portal. And some of that is for transparency, so that all of that communication is on record at the journal, and so that they can monitor that to make sure that all manuscripts are being treated fairly. So it is in the interest of the author to communicate in that style, whether it be questions, whether it be some concerns about reviewer comments, or whether it be just clarifications on some of the logistics of the submission.
To get a little deeper into that, at what point should you, contact? Is it sort of any question you might have based on a review or comment, or should you save it for sort of larger instances, something that, might have more weight to it rather than sort of maybe like a grammatical question that you have from the reviewer?
Most of the questions will be handled through, the central editorial office. And so I think a lot of those will go to the staff who are working full-time for the journal. But if it is something that's more specific to maybe the science or something specific to a reviewer comment, then they'll escalate that to the handling editor. So I would definitely err on saving some of your comments, or just having one or two communications back and forth with them, because otherwise I think the staff will be concerned that you haven't done your homework in terms of reading through the guidelines and things like that. But certainly they are there to help. So I think it's just being intentional about that communication.
I would agree with that. I think, journal offices are overwhelmed with work. There's always more manuscripts and more reviews that need to be done. So handling, one little question here and there, or multiple little questions over and over, gets to be a bit of a chore. So if you can consolidate and send multiple questions at one time, if you need to, that would be the best way to do it.
And then how long should you expect to sort of wait for the editor? Or I guess not expect, but sort of when do you not give up, but when do you maybe move to a different stage of trying to figure out the problem, the question, whatever you're trying to get?
I think a lot of journals have guidelines for their staff and editors in terms of response, and usually it's in the order of 48 hours. However, everyone submits questions on like Friday afternoon, and so there is some grace period, although for many of the journals the associate editors are spread throughout the world, so there's also that. I think that's always the goal from the journal's perspective, is usually a short turnaround time, but inevitably other things will get in the way. But certainly a week would be beyond what a journal would prefer an author or a reviewer waiting for clarifications.
Okay, great. Cool. Should we move on to the next question, or is there anything else you guys would like to add to that? Okay, let's move on. We have a really great list of questions. So do you guys have any suggestions on what guidelines should be followed to maintain the integrity of your science, your data, your experiments that you're working on while you're addressing your reviewer concerns? Is that sort of when you just push back a little bit on the reviewer comments if they might be going against any of that integrity?
Is there an example? I'm trying to think of an example that might be where something like this might come up, where there's some conflict.
We didn't get an example with that question, but we'll see. We're thinking back here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can all see our faces. So, okay, so if somebody is biased or against maybe the theory, the hypotheses, maybe your method that you used, even if there might be evidence that support it.
I see. I think that makes more sense, rather than related to maybe the experiment is like a differing of opinion, so to speak. But I think in part the role of the author is to expect that, especially if it's some work that's maybe novel, because that's usually what the work needs to be. And so there might be some pushback. And so I think in one way is to make sure that the communication is very clear, and acknowledging the other viewpoint, and then being able to support, why this method was utilized, or why the rationale for these hypotheses or these approaches. That's not to say that you're not going to there could be a bias from the reviewer standpoint, but then always going back and seeing, reflecting back and seeing if there's any way that the writing can be improved, so that it becomes very clear. I think it's a different question when especially if it's like late stage of revisions, maybe there's been several revisions and you keep kind of hitting the same comment, even though you feel like you've addressed it. I think that's a little bit different situation and probably happens less often. But in that case, I think corresponding with the handling editor would be really helpful, because they either could provide some clarifications, or they could, in some cases, they may send out to another reviewer, a third or a fourth reviewer, so that there's somebody independently looking at it. Maybe they didn't see the original manuscript, but they're seeing this revised manuscript and they can look at it independently.
I agree with Jill, and I'll add that a couple pieces. So the first, we're all coming to the space with our own expertises, right? And as are your reviewers. And so fully feel that if you at least take a pause to every single recommendation, while you don't have to agree and change and modify things for every single recommendation, what can you take away from each comment and reflect it back, not just in your responses, but also in your manuscript. So just as Jill was pointing out, maybe it's something that perhaps it's just not clear in the way that you've written your manuscript. And so do you need to explain it maybe a little bit better in your manuscript so that the message comes across for all of your readers? And nonetheless, of course, like, people are coming from their individual areas of expertise, and so sometimes that might their recommendations might make sense from where they're sitting and their expertise, and that might not make sense for within the context that the literature, that your background, about why the decisions were made the way that they were made. And so definitely also providing that explanation. You get to decide what is best for when those questions come up, but explain it well to your reviewer, and then take that moment. How do I make this more clear in my manuscript so that some other reader in the future doesn't have the same question, doesn't challenge it the same way? Because the likelihood is that if one or two reviewers brought it up, it's likely that others will have the same question.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm curious, sort of bringing sort of what Sherry said about at a certain point, you have to submit it to a different manuscript or a different journal due to maybe the reviewers are just not going to change their mind about their opinions. Sort of at what stage do you decide that? Is it, 2 reviews in when they're sort of not changing their mind based on that bias? No matter how you changed the wording, how you changed your explanation, do you guys have any sort of recommendations, or do you just cut it early and be like, okay, they don't like this. Here's my first revision back. They're very against whatever it is. I'm just going to cut my losses now and submit somewhere else. Or do you think you should put in the effort once, twice? Do you have any suggestions?
No, I think that's probably a personal decision, how much you want to put yourself through. You may end up in a situation with the new journal, the same situation, same questions. It's possible. I would say if you're willing, maybe give it a second round of review. So do your revision, get your second set of comments back, see where they're at. If they're still on the same page, you may want to start thinking about other journals. If you really want to publish in the journal you're currently working with, you could, if you have a concern, contact, again, the editorial office. They'll let them know that you'd like maybe the editor-in-chief to take a look at it, or ask them if they would, how they feel about the comments, and whether or not you're addressing them I think a lot of editor-in-chiefs will step in when, and make the final decision on those sorts of situations. So, if you give it 2 tries through, two rounds of revisions, and you're still getting that comment, those would, I would probably move on after the second one, or contact, the editor and see if they agree as well, then you're likely to just need to move on.
I agree. I think it's a very personal decision and may also depend on what the comments are that you are kind of seeing, right? I feel like if you have submitted your second round of revisions, you were so close. And I don't know that I would give up that at that point, like you've already made all these changes. That being said, if you were to decide much earlier on, like if you get your first revision letter and, there's just something about it that doesn't jive, even if you submit to a different journal, I would still address the concerns that came up and in some form or fashion. As I was saying, you don't have to change it necessarily. You can disagree, but how did you improve upon so that same comment doesn't come up from a different journal and then you're back at square one. And this has been pointed out. I do these sessions in various spaces, and this came up recently at a session I gave, was that it was somebody did this where they submitted to one journal, then they submitted it to a different journal, when they didn't like the revisions from recommendations from the original journal. But then it was the same same reviewer team that was reviewing for that second journal. So you never know who, this is, it's likely that the experts that review for one journal, if that is an area of expertise, they're going to be reviewing for another journal within that same area of expertise. And so, how much are we really gaining by just starting fresh from within the journal? And then I'll add that similarly, you never know who is the reviewer on the other side. So I think it was Sherry that mentioned this, just like being gracious. The idea that not only are people volunteering their time, but also what if the associate editor happens to be the one that volunteered themselves to be one of the reviewers because it was hard to find. As an associate editor, sometimes it's hard to find folks to be willing to review. And so what if they are the one reviewing and then you come back and are highly critical of the review that they provided? And like that, you don't want to tick off your associate editor. And like they took extra time. So you just never know who's on the other side, and we're all human. And so just kind of be gracious, take in how can this help my paper be better, regardless of whether I stay within this journal or a different journal. How can this improve my writing? Because almost every time it is going to improve your writing. That being said, I also have been on the receiving end of comments that I'm like, well, is that really? So just know how just take it in. How can this make my work better?
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left of this panel. So if there's any audience members who have burning questions, this is a good time to add it to the chat. But speaking of that, there's a question that's related. Do you guys have any strategies of taking in what you learned from that review that you got and using that to better your next manuscript? Because I like to say each sort of, editing session, review session is a learning experience. So do you have, any strategies for people to really learn from that review process?
I think this is true for grant reviews, manuscript reviews. I think every time you submit, regardless if it's successful and it ends up getting published in that journal, those reviews are really helpful. And one of my mentors used to say, like, in those cases, take what's helpful and really integrate that And then, you know, some things aren't going to be as helpful. So maybe you just let that go. But I think, you know, every time you submit and every time you have a reviewer who's willing to take the time and, you know, go through your manuscript and provide those comments, I think certainly making sure that you do a good job, like thinking through those and figuring out how that might inform your future work, I think is critical. And it's one of the benefits of peer review. I don't know if I have specific strategies for how to do that, but I think that that's just should be an expectation that every time you get reviews that you're really trying to integrate those things and learn from the experience. And I think the one thing I'll say, which this was brought up before, is, you know, doing your homework and making sure that you're following the guidelines for a journal so that those comments that you get from reviewers are actually about the science and they're about your work and they're not something about, you know, editorial or grammatical or things like that. They're actually about the science, so they can be helpful. And that way, I think it makes the most use of your time as an author, and it makes the most use of the reviewer and the editor time.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat. So I have one more question, which kind of takes us back to responding to feedback in the reviews. How much, when you're disagreeing with somebody, whether it is just because you disagree or it's a harsh comment or a critical comment, something inappropriate, how much information should you put in that response? Is it just, oh, I'm sorry, I disagree? Or should it be, you know, I disagree, here's all of this evidence? Because I could list, you know, 10 manuscripts about why I disagree with you, or is one okay?
I do think it's important to give your reasoning for why you're disagreeing and why you're not incorporating comments. As it's been pointed out earlier, you know, you do need to address every comment, or you may end up getting that manuscript returned to you again saying you didn't address this comment. So if you don't agree and you don't want to incorporate something, then you really should explain why and give the supporting evidence so that it doesn't come back to you saying, but, you know, you want to have whomever is going to look at that manuscript again say, oh, okay, that makes sense, and just move on.
Yep, absolutely. That your reviewer can look at what you're responding, how you're responding, and be like, okay, like they really thought about this. One of the quotes that I have as an example in one of my slides was, we thoughtfully considered your comment too, right? So you're already like priming your reader, like we thought about this and we decided to go this route, and the A, B, C are the reasons why. You don't have to be very detailed, but yes, you know, showing them, making it easy for them to see. Because the other thing is, like, on the first round, if you convince your associate editor that you did your job, then they don't have to send it out for another round of revisions that then puts you under the microscope yet again. So convince your associate editor from the very first time that you addressed all of these comments, and then you might spare yourself an additional round of revisions.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Just to stay on time, we got to switch over to Andrew, but I just really wanted to thank you three for joining us today and talking about your expertise with navigating submissions. And I hope we answered a lot of questions that float around out there. I know a lot of it was about sort of the negative side of peer review, but I know that sort of is the part that scares us all. So hopefully whoever's doing peer review next, we're not as scared when we open that email and we have some good tips and tricks to answer those. So yeah, we're going to move on to Andrew and learn about media strategies. And do you want to share your screen? You should have access to, or I'm happy to share for you.
I can do it, then could avoid the interaction of next slide, please.
Okay, sounds good.
Spare me a few words. So yes, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Are you seeing the media utilization for research screen, everybody?
Yes, we are.
Excellent. Okay. All right, so I mentioned, I'm sorry, I should mention, I'm sorry for being a little bit late. I had some trouble logging on. So if I missed an introduction before, my apologies. But yes, I'm here to talk about how you can use media to get the word out about your research. It's something I deal with all the time here at UW Health, and I'll get into a little bit more about what I'm doing here, my role with UW Health, and how I assist SMPH, just for your background. But this is what I'm going to try to cover in about 20 minutes or 18 minutes. That sometimes we do these presentations, they take an hour, maybe more. We do these kinds of trainings on a fairly regular basis. So this is what we're going to cover today. Try to get through it as quickly and efficiently as we can. So about me, I'm a media strategist with UW Health. That is also could be referred to as media relations person, PR guy, stuff like that. That's my job here. So while my badge does say UW Health, I support the School of Medicine and Public Health. This is one of those capacities. Also with like student stories, anything to do with administration. A lot of times I'll be the go-between between the school and the media. So one thing I do want to make clear, though, this presentation is just about media relations, not social media. We do interact very closely, but if you have questions about social media, I might not be the best person to answer those, but maybe I could answer some general social media questions at the end if there's time, but just to make that clear. So in fact, right now I'm working with a nephrologist, actually, who just had some research accepted. And this is actually a great segue from the panel discussion that just took place into media, because oftentimes when your manuscript is accepted and they like it, one of the first things that they'll respond to is, we'd like to do a press release about this. Can you put me in touch with your media relations person? And that connection is made. So sometimes that's one way you can get into working with media, is through the journals themselves. So that is something to be prepared for. But then somebody like in my position would often work with you and the journal to get that press release together and then disseminate it. But we'll talk a lot more about that in the next 15 minutes or so. So the media comes in many forms. Some you're familiar with, some you're not. I mentioned research and medical journals here. I'm not talking necessarily about the journal itself and the academic publication that exists. Oftentimes, or sometimes, those journals will have kind of a news component as well. So you may want to reach out to somebody there. Once your thing is published, you might be able to get some media coverage there if they have their own kind of corresponding media outlet. So something to consider. But these are generally the forms of media that we work with when we work with researchers and medical professionals. These are more for your consumption after the fact, but this kind of gives you an idea of where people are consuming their news. This is important to know depending on the subject matter of your work, though. There might be a particular audience that might be more interested in what your research is involved with. So it's good to know who's watching, what outlets. Just a little bit of a snapshot as to how the media landscape is moving around. TV, it's interesting, even though TV is going down, a lot of people still get their news from television. A lot of that has to do with the different ways that TV gets its news out. They often have a very strong online presence through social media. So even though TV in its traditional form is going down, they still have a big role to play in getting your research out there. So even though you might consider, say, the New York Times, that's a great place for you to get research out, or the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, these are places that absolutely do cover research. And there's some great science writers that work for those publications. Most people still get their news or learn about things not from print publications. So don't be afraid to consider television, even if it's not necessarily in your wheelhouse. And this is just kind of reiterating that. On a daily basis, by far, TV is what we deal with most often. It's not even close. So just wanted to present kind of how media is working with us these days. Some of you might recognize all the people in this picture if you're from the Madison area. But during the pandemic, media really opened up to the idea of using virtual communications for their interviews. That's important because if there's a certain outlet or demographic that might not be in your area, and you want to reach them, like if for whatever reason, the focus of your research, it might be impactful in another state. That doesn't mean you can't work with television stations or media outlets in other places, because they're very open to using virtual communications like Zoom or WebEx or whatever to conduct their interviews. So just something to keep in mind, because it play into how you would conduct your interviews, things you need to do to prepare, things like that. So just wanted to make that point. It's not just the reporter shows up with a notepad or calls you on the phone, or a TV camera comes to you. You kind of have to be prepared to do some of this stuff virtually. A few roles of the media, some you might be aware of, some you might not. Obviously, bullets 2 and 4 are things that impact you. A lot of people don't know your research exists, and the research that you're doing may have a profound impact on the world around people. And that's your job, to work with the media and with me and people like me, to get your research out into the world so people can see all these things, these great things that are going on. And a wonderful example is at UW-Madison, there's a cancer researcher who's researching antibodies in sharks for cancer research. You might have all seen that news over the last couple of years. I mean, who knew that was going on right here in Madison? Well, that researcher had the foresight to work with media to disseminate this information, and now it had a few pretty popular TV features done around it. So when do you want to interact with media? There's generally 2 scenarios. The media might catch wind of your research through a variety of ways. A friend of a friend, maybe they saw it in a journal, they might reach out to you. Or, which is more often the case, you might have a great story. Your research might be wonderful. Maybe and there's even like a research participant who has a great story. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons you might want to reach out to media. Then you want to reach out. Both cases are great opportunities to get your research out there. You just have to kind of know when is the time to interact and how to do that. Now, let's say, like this researcher I'm working on with nephrology right now, he learned very quickly that his research was accepted and reached out like right away. Like, I've got this great research. It's about climate change and kidney function, and it's really interesting. And he got the ball rolling like right away, so we could talk and prepare about this or prepare for this before the publication date and the embargo lifted on the journal. So we'll be ready for this when it happens. So don't wait to get your news out. Contact your professional. If you don't have one, we'll talk about what to do in a minute. All right, so what types of research are the media interested in? There are a couple of things I've learned over the years of being on this side of the fence. I was a newspaper reporter in a previous life. But what we've learned in the years doing this is, if you've got research that's like the first to like reveal a new idea or an intervention, whenever that research is right, like on the cutting edge, there's a really good chance the media is going to be interested in that. I kind of misspoke with the second bullet. What I wanted to say with that is, if you're doing like review of other people's data, even if it's like a large sample size, media doesn't tend to want to do that kind of stuff. They're really focused on original research. So something done in your lab, or like if it's a clinical trial, something that's being done here, something that's actively done. So if you're considering trying media, if it's a review of existing research, it needs to be like really impactful and unique. I mean, I can't say that they'll never take that kind of stuff, but original research is definitely more interesting to the media. And the larger the sample size is also really important, because if your research is done on, just a handful of animals, or if it's in human trials, something like that, the larger the sample size, the better. It gives, I mean, I don't need to explain why that's important. You understand that, but it also matters to media. So just a couple of things to keep in mind is when you're considering, well, is my research really that interesting? Well, it could be. So keep those things in mind. So when media is involved, what should you do? My best advice is to take a deep breath. If you get on the phone with a reporter, if they just happen to call you instead of emailing you, ask a little bit about what they're interested in, but don't agree to it right away. It might not be a publication you want to participate in. You can learn a little bit about them and give some time to think about it. If it's an email or they leave a voicemail, the first thing you should do is reach out to someone like me. So if you're here at SMPH, you could also reach out to Robin Perrin. She's the Chief Communications Officer for the School of Medicine and Public Health, and she's intimately involved with discussing what kind of research we want to promote here, but can also advise on and work very closely with me on whether we should consider this for media, what outlets we should reach out to, timelines, all of those kind of things. So when you get this call, kind of, again, take a step back, think about, should I do this? Is this the right outlet? Reach out to your communications people and just get the ball rolling. So what we do, kind of, these are different roles. I kind of touched on this earlier. But sometimes you hear us called PIOs. That's more like an emergency response situation if there's an active situation going on. But in certain circumstances, certain organizations, that person might carry a dual role and do more media relations as well. This is kind of what we do. One of the important functions that we serve for researchers is you've got a very intense, detailed job. You've got a lot of work to do, a lot to focus on. We would kind of work with the reporter for you, so you don't have to handle all these dozens of emails that go back and forth and working on timing and setting up interviews, things like that. So if you have a communications person, a media relations person at your institution, don't be afraid to utilize them. They can really take a load off of your plate so that you can focus on, the final touches of getting your manuscript accepted to a journal. That happens very often when a researcher, especially people who have done media for some time, know that they could get their manuscript accepted or it's preliminarily accepted and they're still going through the revision process. They've reached out to me. A great example of this is Rebecca Meyerson at the Population Health Sciences. When she gets something accepted, even if it's not finalized, she reaches out. And we kind of get the ball rolling on this so that when it is fully accepted and we have a publication date, the press release is already written, we've got it, a media list of reporters we want to reach out to, all of it's all set. Once the embargo lifts, we hit send and everything rolls on that same day. So we can do that work for you so you don't have to do it. You can focus on these other things. Now, if you don't have a media relations person, try to move quickly here. You can still do all of this. You just have to learn how to do it on your own. The most important thing is making sure you understand who the reporter is. Is this an outlet you want to be a part of? Sometimes people will say they're from a reputable outlet and you look them up and they're really not. So there's all, you just have to be very careful with who you're working with. So you also want to dig into the outlet itself. They might, especially with trade publications, there are more of these coming up where people are leaving kind of mainstream media and starting like nonprofit newsrooms and things like that. They can oftentimes have like a slant, I guess. That's bad jargon, but they definitely look for certain stories and some of them are overt more about the types of stories that they want. And you need to understand that and be comfortable being associated with those types of stories when you work with these reporters. It's always best to work with reputable science writers, like they understand things a little bit better. So you look at stories that they've done previously. That'll give you a really good sense if they really know what you're talking about. Because you're experienced researchers, you're going to know, well, that reporter really didn't explain this right. Like, I know what that is, and they didn't really get that right. You don't want to deal with that if you can. So look into the previous work, look into the background of the outlet, and consider if it's worth your time. Oh, excuse me for a second. And consider trade publications. They're great for research. Places like I've mentioned a few here, but there's dozens of them. They're great for research because the science writers are often experienced, and it's a good it's a smooth process when you're working with the trade publications because of their experience. 3 main types of media that you'll encounter. There are podcasts out there as well, which are definitely worth your time if it's the right kind of outlet. But they're pretty much the way that radio is done. It's just a lot of it is longer form radio, basically. We'll just run through these quick because I know we only have a few minutes left. Print, there are fewer time constraints, so you can kind of get more information out to the reporter, and there won't be any limitations on the size of the story. Recorded radio stories, recorded TV stories are 1 minute, 2 minutes at the most, so there's not a lot of information you can get in there. So when you give your talking points, your sound bites, you need to be a little bit more concise with radio and TV. Excuse me. Now, a great place, we have researchers do this fairly often, is to get into live radio, because they have longer segments sometimes. And you can take caller questions. So it's really interesting. If you have a topic that you feel you can convey to the general mass audience, it's a really interesting way to get a real-time sense of how people feel about your research. And you can also dispel myths or help explain more complicated concepts in a scenario with real people in real time. So it's interesting, something to consider for sure. And in Wisconsin, we're blessed to have Wisconsin Public Radio because they look for stories like this. TV, I mentioned, it's very time constricted. Even though, as I mentioned right off the top, it's very well consumed type of media, you have to prepare for it very well. You have to have your talking points really defined, narrowed down, and be ready to deliver them in a short, concise manner. These are some tips. Again, you can have the slides. These are things that will help you if you do have to do interviews virtually. We don't have to go through all of them right here. That's something more for when we have a longer period of time. But these are a couple of things I did want to mention when you do get to actually participating in your media interviews. This first bullet shouldn't be very difficult. We live and breathe this stuff. It's the main issue there is you want to have those things into like concise sound bites and talking points. When you do talk with reporters, you don't have to answer their questions. If they ask you questions that are controversial, not related to your subject matter, you can say something like, well, I can't really speak to that, and go back to kind of your main talking points about what your research really is all about, how it can help society, things like that. Media members are not your friends, but you do want to be friendly with them. If you get too close of a relationship with a reporter, it does happen where people divulge things that they shouldn't. But you don't want to be so abrasive that they don't want to work with you again. This is kind of a catchphrase that's always helped me with our experts in conveying this idea that you want them to come back to us, but you can't become fully comfortable with them like you would a friend. Generally talk a little slower if you're doing recorded interviews. And the last bullet, always assume everything is on the record, always, even if they say it's not. I can't stress that enough. So some reasons to do research in the media, a reason to get it out there. You have added credibility. You've spent your life like dedicated to this craft, and that comes through. It's just the way that you are able to convey things that other people don't even consider. I would strongly consider doing media if it's the right fit for your research. I would say even if you're a little apprehensive, it gives you added credibility. It gives the reporter's story more credibility. It also helps raise your profile. Like, you're trying to get your name out there. So people, other researchers, other journals, granting agencies, people see you out there and they see your work getting noticed. Like, that matters. And then just a couple of points to reiterate on the way out. All right. So it's close, 1 minute long, but my apologies.
Oh, it's totally okay. If you have any questions, we can take one question. I know we're right at 1 o'clock, but we can squeeze it in. Anybody out there has a question for Andrew? We'll give him 30 seconds. I have one question since
Sure.
Nobody's asking.
Please.
If somebody works with you, would you work with them through interview training?
Absolutely. Yep.
Great.
And any media relations person would, if you're at a different institution, if you have one, it's a primary function of what they do.
Great, wonderful. Well, for everybody that is still listening, we really appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate Andrew and our 3 panelists. We will share these slides, so their emails will be available, especially if you want to contact Andrew and their team to get some media relations out there training done. We appreciate you. This was our last session, like I mentioned, of our manuscript writing series. I'll be sending out a survey maybe early next week just to get a sense of how you felt about the entire series. But we really appreciate you joining us along this journey, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.